My parents always made one thing clear. Their priority was my sister. I was the background kid, the one who worked hard but never stood in the spotlight. The greatest accomplishment of my life was buying my dream car. It wasn't just a car, it was the proof of every sacrifice I'd made, every hour I worked while others were out enjoying their youth. To me, it represented hope. To my parents, it was just another possession they could hand over to my sister. When they sold it for her, I realized exactly where I stood in my family. My effort, my sweat, and my pride meant nothing compared to her convenience. In their eyes, my dream could be discarded if it meant she got what she wanted. That wasn't just about losing a car. That was about being told once again that I didn't matter. That no matter how hard I worked, I would never be enough in their eyes. In that moment, I had a choice. I could accept my role as the invisible son, or I could make a promise to myself that one day this injustice would come full circle. I chose the second path. For years, that decision lived quietly inside me like a fire. Every step I took, every goal I chased, carried the memory of what I'd lost. I worked not just to succeed, but to prove, first to myself, and eventually to them, that my efforts had value. My sister treated the car as nothing more than a gift. She never thought about what it cost me to earn it. She didn't see the late nights, the skipped meals, or the sacrifices. For her, it was just another benefit of being the favorite child. For me, it was the symbol of everything I had poured myself into. When it was taken away, I wasn't the same anymore. I channeled that pain into determination. I stopped waiting for approval that would never come and built my own path. Their favoritism no longer defined me, it fueled me. The more they dismissed me, the harder I pushed forward. And eventually, the day came when the balance shifted. The day my sister had to face the reality she had avoided her entire life. The day she had to repay every cent, every dollar that car had cost me. This story isn't about a car, it's about betrayal, sacrifice, and redemption. It's about the quiet family member who no one noticed until the moment they could no longer ignore him. It's about proving that silent effort carries weight, and that overlooked sacrifices don't stay invisible forever. And that was the moment my parents finally realized what their choice had cost them. Welcome, story lovers. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. People often assume unfair treatment begins with one big dramatic moment, like the day my dream car slipped through my fingers. But in truth, injustice in families usually grows slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you look back and realize the pattern was there all along. My story wasn't just about a car. It was about years of being the shadow child, the one left behind while my sister stood in the spotlight. And if you want to understand how that car symbolized everything I had fought for, you have to know where it all began. I was born into a household that believed in hierarchy, even if no one openly admitted it. My sister Emily was the golden child. From the time she could walk, my parents seemed to orbit around her like she was the sun. She got the bows, the pictures, the little extra treats at the grocery store. I got hand-me-downs and pats on the back. And while most kids wouldn't notice these things, I did. I always felt the difference, not just in what we were given, but in how we were treated. Our childhood photos tell the story better than words. Emily was in front, smiling in new dresses while I was somewhere off to the side, squeezed into clothes I'd already outgrown. My parents would beam with pride when Emily spoke up in school events, but when it was my turn, they'd nod politely, then go back to talking about her latest achievement. To them, she was the future. I was just there. Still, I tried to make peace with it. I was the quieter one, the type to get lost in books or daydreams. Where Emily wanted the spotlight, I wanted freedom. My dream wasn't glitz. It was independence. I didn't want fancy things handed to me. I wanted to build my own life, piece by piece. Maybe that's why, even as a kid, I gravitated toward cars. Cars meant movement, control, possibility. They were the opposite of standing in someone else's shadow. By the time I hit high school, the gap between Emily and me was impossible to ignore. She was the social butterfly, the cheer captain, the homecoming queen type. My parents funded every outfit, every ticket, every hobby she wanted. If she wanted dance classes, the checkbook came out. If she wanted a new laptop, it was delivered the next day. And when I asked for something as simple as extra money for art supplies, the response was usually, "Do you really need that? You should be saving." It wasn't cruelty. It was subtle dismissal. But over time, it cut deep. School itself was a battleground for me. I wasn't the smartest, but I worked harder than most. I stayed up late studying, not because anyone expected me to, but because I believed hard work could close the gap between privilege and neglect. I dreamed of going to college, studying business, and maybe one day starting something of my own. But in a house where resources were funneled toward one child, dreams felt like luxuries. The first real crack came when college applications rolled around. Emily had her tuition saved, almost as if the universe had been conspiring for years to make sure her path was paved in gold. For me, there was no savings account, no plan. "We'll see what we can do," my parents said, which was code for, "You're on your own." And I was. I applied for scholarships, begged for financial aid, took on part-time jobs just to keep the idea of college alive. When Emily got into her top school, my parents threw a party. When I got my acceptance letter, it barely made the dinner table conversation. But the truth is, I didn't let it break me. I learned early that life wasn't going to hand me things, so I developed grit. I worked odd jobs, everything from bussing, tables to mowing lawns. Every paycheck went into savings, and every long shift became a reminder that if I wanted something, I'd have to earn it tenfold compared to Emily. While she lived out the life of ease, I learned survival. It was during those years that my dream of owning a car, my own car, began to crystallize. To most people, a car is just transportation. To me, it was proof that I could take myself places, even when no one else believed in me. I started reading about cars, memorizing specs, setting aside money like it was sacred. It wasn't just a purchase I wanted, it was validation. Every dollar I saved was a brick in the foundation of my independence. But dreams rarely grow uninterrupted. My family's finances began to strain, not because of me, but because of the constant spending on Emily. Trips, gadgets, extracurriculars, you name it. And while they poured money into her, they leaned on me as a safety net. "Can you pick up groceries this week? Do you mind helping with the bills?" I didn't argue, because part of me still wanted to be the good son, the one who carried his weight. But it stung to know my sacrifices weren't matched by recognition. The unspoken message was always the same. Emily was the investment, and I was the insurance. She was the dream. I was the duty. And though I smiled through it, every small sacrifice stacked up like pebbles in my pocket, weighing me down while she soared higher on wings I never had. The funny thing about carrying responsibility is that after a while, people stop seeing it as sacrifice and start seeing it as your duty. That's how it was in my family. Every time I stepped up, it became less of a favor and more of an expectation. If Emily needed help with her projects, I was the built-in tutor. If Mom needed errands done, I was the runner. If Dad had something heavy to lift, I was the muscle. The logic seemed to be, he can handle it. He always does. And maybe they were right, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. In those years, I worked more than I slept. During the day, I was a student trying to hold on to the dream of higher education. At night, I became a worker who was constantly trading time for survival. While Emily relaxed in her dorm room with her friends, I was wiping down counters at a local diner, inhaling the smell of greasy fries until it seeped into my clothes. Sometimes I'd get home past midnight, collapse on the couch, and still be expected to drive her to early morning appointments the next day. My parents would say, "You know she has a lot on her plate," as if my own plate wasn't overflowing. But I kept saving. Every dollar was guarded, every expense calculated. I didn't waste money on clothes or nights out. My friends would invite me places, but I declined more often than not. They thought I was boring. What they didn't know was that I was protecting something sacred, the dream of finally buying my own car. I had pictures taped to the wall above my bed, sleek models I admired, not even the fanciest ones, just reliable cars that represented freedom. For me, walking into a dealership one day and signing my name would be a declaration that I had made it through the noise. Of course, the noise got louder. My parents began leaning on me financially in ways that went beyond groceries. When unexpected bills came up, I was the first phone call. "Can you spot us until next week? Just cover this one thing and we'll pay you back." But I knew better. They rarely did. I learned not to expect repayment, only to brace myself for the next ask. And the hardest part? Watching them buy Emily little luxuries while I was draining myself to keep the family afloat. They didn't see the irony. They thought they were keeping the household together. They didn't notice that it was me holding it all up. And yet, I never stopped pushing forward. I didn't want bitterness to define me. My faith was in hard work, not in resentment. I told myself, one day it'll pay off. One day they'll see me. That thought was my anchor. It kept me from drowning in the unfairness. When I finally scraped together enough money to start looking seriously at cars, it felt like stepping into another world. I remember sitting at my laptop late at night, browsing used car websites, comparing models, calculating insurance costs. Every time I found one that seemed within reach, I'd imagine myself behind the wheel, music on, windows down, going wherever I wanted without needing anyone's permission. It wasn't just a car, it was escape. It was the power to carve out a life where I wasn't second choice. But just as I got closer to my goal, life had a way of tightening its grip. My father had health issues that required expensive medication. My mom worked part-time, but her income barely covered essentials. Emily, of course, remained untouched by these realities. She was focused on her studies. So naturally they turned to me again. "You're doing well with your jobs," they said. "You can help." And I did. I couldn't stand by and watch my family sink, even if it meant delaying my own dream. That's the part people don't always understand. You can be angry at your family and still love them enough to bleed for them. Still, the resentment grew. Every time I handed over money, I felt my dream slipping a little further away. My savings account, once my pride, became a revolving door. I'd fill it up with months of grueling work, only to watch it drain in a single request. But I kept quiet. I didn't want to be the selfish one. I didn't want to be accused of caring more about a car than my family's needs. So I sacrificed in silence, carrying my frustration like a secret no one could see. The breaking point came the summer before Emily's graduation. She wanted a car. Of course she did. She wanted the convenience, the freedom, the image of pulling up to campus like she owned the world. And when she asked, my parents didn't hesitate. They decided to sell the very car I had been saving toward, the one I had practically paid for with my blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. They didn't even consult me. One day it was mine in spirit, the next day it was gone, with Emily holding the keys. Their reasoning? "She needs it more. You'll understand. You're stronger than she is." I can't even describe the feeling of watching her drive off in what should have been mine. It wasn't just about the car. It was the years of sacrifice, the countless shifts, the postponed dreams, all funneled into her comfort. My patience, which had stretched and bent for so long, finally cracked. For the first time in my life, I stopped swallowing the injustice and started tasting it. and it was bitter. That moment didn't just scar me. It ignited something. It made me vow that one day this story wouldn't end with me as the overlooked child. One day the scales would balance, and when they did, it wouldn't be through anger or revenge, but through the undeniable weight of my own success. When my parents sold the car for Emily, something inside me broke, but it also woke me up. I had spent years bending, adjusting, and excusing their favoritism, but this was different. This was the dream I had built piece by piece, stripped away in a single decision, and the worst part? They acted like it was normal, like I should simply nod and accept it because family comes first. But what they really meant was, Emily comes first. I came second, if I even ranked at all. At first, I didn't lash out. I didn't scream or demand explanations. I just shut down. I stopped talking much at dinner, stopped volunteering for favors, stopped rushing to solve their problems. It wasn't rebellion. It was survival. I realized that if I didn't start protecting myself, there would be nothing left of me to give. And yet, inside, I was wrestling with guilt. Because when you grow up as the dependable one, it feels wrong to stop giving. You're conditioned to believe your worth comes from sacrifice. Learning to withhold felt like betraying who I was. But slowly, I started reclaiming small pieces of my life. I picked up extra hours at work, not to bail out the family, but to rebuild my savings. This time, I guarded it more fiercely. I stopped mentioning it to anyone because in my house, the moment people knew you had money, it was already spoken for. I also invested in myself, not in luxuries, but in growth. I bought books about business, watched tutorials late at night, taught myself skills that might one day translate into independence. Every time I learned something new, I felt like I was quietly stacking bricks for a future no one could take from me. The tension at home grew. Emily would breeze in with her new car, proud of the convenience it gave her, while I'd trudge home from work smelling like dish soap and sweat. My parents praised her accomplishments, her grades, her internships, her bright future. My achievements, they barely registered. If I brought up the hours I was working, they'd say, "That's what responsibility looks like." If Emily got a B+ on a test, they threw a celebration. The imbalance was exhausting, but it also steeled me. I learned to stop waiting for their approval and to start building validation within myself. There were nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying everything. The late shifts, the hand-me-downs, the ignored victories. I thought about how easily my parents dismissed my sacrifices, and I felt anger burn in my chest. But underneath that anger was a determination so sharp it almost scared me. I told myself, one day this will change. Not because they choose to treat me differently, but because I'll create a life so undeniable that they'll have no choice but to see me. And so, my struggles became fuel. Every humiliation, every overlooked moment, every stolen dream, it all pushed me harder. I started saving with a new mindset, not just for a car, but for freedom. I wanted to build something that couldn't be taken from me, something that wasn't subject to my parents' whims. That's when I realized the true power of my struggle. It was teaching me resilience most people never learn. While Emily floated through life on a cushion of support, I was learning how to fight for every inch. And those lessons, painful as they were, would become my foundation. Of course, the journey wasn't smooth. There were setbacks, times when unexpected expenses wiped out my savings, times when exhaustion nearly broke me. There were moments of deep loneliness when I wished someone would notice how hard I was working, how much I was sacrificing. But no recognition came, and so I learned to live without it. Instead, I found strength in the very silence that used to crush me. If no one was going to cheer for me, I would cheer for myself. If no one was going to invest in me, I would invest in myself. Looking back, those years were brutal. They tested me in ways I wouldn't wish on anyone. But they also shaped me into someone who could withstand pressure, someone who wouldn't crumble when life got hard. And though I didn't know it at the time, Every long shift, every dollar saved, every moment of being overlooked was setting the stage for the turning point of my life. The moment when the imbalance would finally shift. My parents thought they were teaching me duty, but what they really taught me was strength. And my sister, shielded from struggle, had no idea that the scales of life don't stay tilted forever. By the time I reached adulthood, I wasn't just the forgotten child anymore. I was the survivor, the builder, the one who could turn scraps into something solid. I had endured the pain of being second best, but I was ready to use that pain as fuel. And though my parents couldn't see it yet, the very thing they dismissed, the quiet determination they underestimated, would one day become the force that changed everything. Because here's the truth. Dreams don't die when they're stolen. They smolder, they simmer, and they wait for the right moment to blaze again. And my dream, the car, the independence, the recognition, wasn't gone. It was waiting. Waiting for the day I would rise from the shadows and make everyone who doubted me face the weight of my worth. The thing about injustice is that it doesn't just break you, it reshapes you. For years, I had been the silent carrier of burdens, the one who worked and sacrificed without complaint. But after the car incident, silence no longer felt like strength. It felt like complicity. And once that realization hit, there was no going back. I knew I couldn't change the past, but I could change what came next. At first, my turning point didn't look like much. It started with a promotion at one of my jobs. I had been working part-time at a local logistics company, doing grunt work in the warehouse, loading, sorting, anything they threw at me. It wasn't glamorous, but I showed up early, stayed late, and never cut corners. One day, the floor manager pulled me aside. He said, "You've got something the others don't. You pay attention." That comment may have sounded small, but to me, it was the first time in years someone noticed my effort. And for once, it wasn't followed by an ask, a favor, or a dismissal. It was recognition. The promotion wasn't huge. I became a shift lead, but it meant stability. It meant I wasn't just disposable labor. More importantly, it gave me access to parts of the operation I hadn't seen before. The paperwork, the scheduling, the inner workings of how things moved. For someone like me, who had always craved independence, it was intoxicating. I started realizing that I wasn't just good at hard work. I was good at strategy, at connecting dots, at seeing patterns others ignored. It was the first glimmer of proof that maybe I wasn't destined to stay in the background forever. But with opportunity came obstacles. Not everyone liked my sudden rise. There were co-workers who had been around longer who thought they deserved the spot more. They whispered about me, saying I was a brown noser, a workaholic, a guy trying too hard. And maybe I was. But what they didn't see was that I wasn't chasing approval. I was fighting for survival. Their resentment stung, but it also prepared me for something bigger. Learning how to operate in an environment where people don't want you to succeed. Around this time, I also met someone who would quietly change the course of my life. His name was Mr. Carter, one of the senior supervisors. He wasn't flashy or loud, but he had the kind of presence you notice. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, he caught me reviewing schedules and inventory logs long after my work was done. Instead of scolding me, he asked why I was there. I told him the truth. "I'm trying to understand how this all works." He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss me. He nodded and said, "That's how you get ahead. Don't just do the job. Learn the system." That sentence stuck with me. For the first time, I had something resembling a mentor, someone who saw me as more than just extra hands. Carter began giving me tips, small insights into leadership, problem-solving, even people management. He didn't hand me opportunities on a silver platter, but he planted seeds. And those seeds gave me hope. But here's the irony. Just as my professional world started expanding, my family life grew more suffocating. Emily's needs never slowed down. Her car needed maintenance. Her lifestyle demanded cash, and somehow, My parents always found ways to pull me back into the cycle of sacrifice. Every time I thought I was moving forward, there was another call for help. It was a tug of war between my emerging independence and their never-ending expectations. And while part of me wanted to say no, another part couldn't completely cut them off. After all, they were still my family. And family ties aren't easy to sever, no matter how unfair. The real conflict began when I discovered something that pushed me into uncharted territory. One evening, while cleaning up paperwork in the office, I noticed some irregularities in the company's accounts. At first, I thought it was a simple mistake. Numbers that didn't line up, totals that didn't make sense. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized it wasn't an accident. Someone was manipulating the records, small adjustments here, hidden expenses there. It all pointed to money being siphoned off. It wasn't my job to notice, but I couldn't unsee it. And once again, I faced a familiar choice: stay silent or risk speaking up. This time, though, silence didn't sit right. Maybe it was the years of being ignored, the years of swallowing injustice, but I couldn't let it go. I began keeping notes, tracking patterns, connecting dots late at night. It felt dangerous, because if I was wrong, I could lose the one stable job I had. But if I was right, it could change everything. It was my first real ethical dilemma: protect myself or take a risk for the truth. And in that dilemma, I felt the weight of my past pressing down. All my life I had been quiet. All my life I had let others dictate what I deserved. But this time, I wanted to be different. This time, I wanted to choose courage, even if it came at a cost. The next few weeks were a test of patience, nerve, and strategy. By day, I was just another shift lead, directing workers, checking logs, making sure trucks left on time. By night, I was quietly piecing together a puzzle no one else dared to touch. Every receipt, every invoice, every adjustment became a clue. The numbers told a story, and it wasn't a clean one. Someone high up was bleeding the company dry, and they were doing it cleverly enough that most people wouldn't notice. But I wasn't most people. I had a reason to notice. I had lived my whole life catching details that others ignored, because details determined survival. Still, doubt gnawed at me. What if I was wrong? What if I was chasing shadows? After all, I wasn't an accountant, just a warehouse worker with ambition. But then I remembered those late nights from my past, when I studied finance textbooks by the dim glow of my phone. I remembered how I used to dream of becoming more, of stepping into a career where numbers and truth mattered. This investigation wasn't just about the company. It was about proving to myself that I wasn't trapped in mediocrity forever. The pressure mounted when whispers started circulating. A co-worker named Mark, one of the ones who resented my promotion, kept giving me side glances. He noticed I stayed late, asked too many questions, looked too carefully at paperwork. One evening, he cornered me in the break room. "You think you're smarter than the rest of us, don't you?" he sneered. I didn't rise to the bait. I just told him I'm trying to do my job. But inside, I felt the warning. If Mark suspected anything, it could blow up before I was ready. That's when Carter stepped in again. Somehow, he sensed my inner conflict. One night, he found me staring at spreadsheets long after everyone had gone home. He didn't ask directly, but he said something that felt like a test. Sometimes, doing the right thing comes with a price tag. The question is, can you afford to pay it? His words rattled me. Did he know? Was he hinting at something? I couldn't be sure. But I realized then that whatever I was about to do, I couldn't do it recklessly. If I made a move, it had to be calculated, undeniable, airtight. Meanwhile, my family drama added fuel to the fire. Emily had just crashed her car, the same one my parents had sold my dream for. Insurance covered part of it, but not all. And guess who they expected to help cover the rest? Me. Again. I stared at my mother's text one night asking if I could pitch in just this once. Just this once. How many times had I heard that phrase? Each time it meant emptying my pockets, sacrificing my plans, erasing myself. This time, something hardened inside me. I didn't respond. I let the phone buzz until it went silent. That silence wasn't just rebellion. It was clarity. I realized I had been living in two worlds, one where I was constantly diminished and one where I was beginning to rise. I couldn't serve both masters anymore. If I wanted to step into a new future, I had to let go of the role my family had chained me to. And maybe, just maybe, exposing the truth at work was my way out. The ethical dilemma grew heavier. On one side was security, keeping my head down, protecting the paycheck I desperately needed. On the other side was risk, standing up, speaking truth, and possibly losing everything. Nights blurred together as I pored over figures, building a case only I could see. The numbers screamed corruption. The only question was whether I had the courage to act. Then came the breaking point. One Thursday evening, I was called into a last-minute meeting. The regional director, a man named Holloway, was reviewing quarterly reports. As I stood in the back of the room watching charts and graphs flash across the projector screen, I caught something that made my stomach twist. The exact same adjustment I had been tracking, the one that masked nearly $500,000, was being praised as smart accounting. The room applauded. I felt my chest tighten. They weren't just covering mistakes, they were celebrating them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, thinking of all the sacrifices I had made, the years of being overlooked, the car that was never mine, the endless debts my family dumped on me. And now, here I was, staring at proof that the powerful could bend truth for their gain, while people like me broke their backs just to survive. The injustice was unbearable. I knew with bone-deep certainty that silence was no longer an option. I began drafting my plan. Not reckless, not emotional, methodical. I started compiling a private file, photos, spreadsheets, handwritten notes. I disguised it as personal budgeting documents, just in case someone stumbled across them. Slowly, I was building my arsenal. The idea wasn't just to expose, it was to make sure they couldn't bury the evidence. But with every step, the stakes rose. If I got caught snooping, I could be fired instantly. If word spread, I'd be branded a troublemaker, maybe even blacklisted from future jobs. And yet, in the midst of all this fear, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. For once, I wasn't reacting to life. I was steering it, and that shift, scary as it was intoxicating. The turning point wasn't just about numbers. It was about reclaiming my voice. For too long, I had let others write my story, my parents, my sister, my circumstances. But now, I was writing my own chapter. And though I didn't know how it would end, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be silent anymore. The weeks that followed were some of the most exhausting of my life. Every day felt like walking a tightrope. On the surface, I acted normal, clocking in, supervising the floor, cracking a few jokes with coworkers. But beneath that mask, I was waging a private war. My mind was constantly calculating, questioning, preparing. How much longer could I keep this hidden? How much evidence was enough? And more importantly, what was I willing to risk? The answer came faster than I expected. One Friday afternoon, as I was finishing up paperwork, Mark, the coworker, who always seemed a little too curious, showed up at my desk. He leaned against the filing cabinet, smirking. "You've been real busy lately," he said. "Late nights? Extra notes? What's that about?" His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. I felt a chill run down my spine. Did he know? Or was he fishing? Either way, I kept my face blank. "Just keeping things organized," I replied. He shrugged, but the look he gave me before leaving said it all. He didn't believe me. That encounter lit a fire under me. If Mark suspected something, others might too. I had to move faster. I doubled down on my secret work, making copies of reports, snapping discrete photos with my phone, and cross-checking everything against older files. The deeper I went, the worse it looked. This wasn't a small error. It was a deliberate siphoning of funds. Adjustments, inflated expenses, creative write-offs. They had built an entire system of deceit, and the higher-ups were in on it. One night, as I sat in my small apartment surrounded by papers and coffee cups, I felt the weight of it all pressing down. My head throbbed, my eyes burned, but my heart pounded with something that felt like destiny. For so long, I had been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. Now I held something powerful, the truth. The question was, how to use it. It wasn't just about exposing the fraud. It was about proving, to myself and to everyone who had ever doubted me, that I was capable of more. I thought of my parents, who always prioritized Emily. I thought of my sister, who drove around in what should have been my car. And I thought of the countless times I had been told to be patient or do the right thing while watching my dreams burn. This wasn't just about justice for the company. This was about reclaiming the dignity I had been denied. But dignity doesn't come without risk. The fear was real. If I stepped forward, I could lose everything. Jobs like mine weren't easy to come by, and I had bills to pay. If they blacklisted me, what then? What if no one believed me? Or worse, what if they turned it around and painted me as the villain? These questions kept me awake at night. Yet every time I considered backing down, I remembered the applause in that meeting when they praised a fraudulent report. That sound haunted me. It reminded me that silence was complicity. The tension bled into my personal life. My mom called again, reminding me that Emily was struggling after her accident and needed financial help. The implication was clear. I should sacrifice again. Something inside me snapped. For the first time in my life, I said no. I didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't soften it. Just no. The silence on the other end of the phone was heavy, followed by a disappointed sigh. "You've changed," she muttered. She was right. I had. And I wasn't going back. Around this time, Carter reappeared in a way that surprised me. He wasn't just a mentor now. He became a mirror. One evening, while we were walking the floor, he leaned close and said, "You're carrying a lot more than boxes these days." My chest tightened. Did he know? Was he warning me? I didn't answer, but his presence steadied me. It felt like permission to keep going, as if he understood the path I was on and was silently rooting for me. The final push came during another quarterly meeting. This time, Holloway wasn't just praising adjustments, he was directing them. He used phrases like creative strategy and protecting the narrative, and the entire room nodded along. I felt rage bubbling inside me. They weren't just bending the truth, they were building an empire on lies, and everyone who clapped was complicit. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew then that I was done being silent. That night, I made my decision. I wasn't going to wait for the perfect moment or the perfect plan. The risk would never go away. The only choice was whether I was willing to take it. I pulled out my folder, the one with weeks of evidence, and began drafting an anonymous report. I wrote carefully, methodically, attaching spreadsheets, annotated, copies and photos. My hands trembled as I typed, but my resolve was steady. When it was finished, I stared at the screen for what felt like an hour, my finger hovering over the send button. My entire future rested on one click. Finally, I hit send. A rush of adrenaline surged through me, followed by crushing silence. There was no going back now. I had crossed the line. Whether it ended in triumph or disaster, I had chosen to fight. For the first time in my life, I felt free. The days after I sent that anonymous report were the longest of my life. I expected Fireworks, confrontations, maybe even police sirens. Instead, silence. Weeks passed, and the company rolled on as if nothing had happened. At first, I wondered if my email had even been received. Maybe the evidence got lost in a spam folder, buried under thousands of junk messages. Or maybe someone high up had intercepted it, shredding it before it reached the right eyes. That silence became its own form of torture. I went to work every day, carrying the weight of a secret no one else knew I had unleashed. The managers strutted around with their false confidence. Reports were paraded as successful strategies, and Holloway's smirk grew sharper with every meeting. I began to feel invisible again, the same way I had felt in my own family. Once more I had risked everything, and once more I was overlooked. But deep down, I knew the truth had power. Lies could only stretch so far before snapping. And that snap came suddenly, almost violently. It started with whispers. A couple of accountants from headquarters visited the warehouse under the guise of a routine review. Their sharp suits and colder-than-ice expressions told me this was no routine. They spent days in a closed office, combing through files, requesting backups, demanding logs. Employees started speculating. Something was wrong, and the tension was palpable. I pretended to be clueless, but my heart beat harder with every hour. Then came the summons. An email arrived in my inbox late one afternoon. Mandatory attendance, financial integrity review, Conference Hall A, 9 a.m. The me subject line alone was enough to turn stomachs. Everyone was required. Everyone. The next morning, the atmosphere was electric. The entire staff crowded into the hall, buzzing with rumors. Executives lined the front row, their smiles tight, their hands fidgeting. Holloway stood at the podium, projecting authority he no longer truly had. He cleared his throat, announced that allegations of irregularities had surfaced, and assured us that everything was under control. His voice cracked on those last words. That's when I knew. The report had landed. But I also knew this wasn't the climax. The storm hadn't fully arrived yet. A week later, the board of directors called an emergency meeting. Not just executives, but regional heads, legal teams, and even outside auditors were present. I wasn't supposed to be there. Employees at my level were excluded from boardrooms like these. But somehow, my name appeared on the attendance list. Whether it was intentional or a clerical oversight, I never found out. All I knew was that when I walked into that polished, intimidating room, heads turned. I was out of place, and everyone knew it. The CFO frowned. "Excuse me, this is a closed meeting," he snapped. The words echoed against the paneled walls, dismissive and sharp, cutting straight to the bone. For a second, old instincts pulled at me. Shrink back, apologize, leave quietly. That was the role I had played my entire life. Silent, compliant, invisible, but not today. I stood a little taller, clutching the folder I had brought with me. "You might want to open it," I said calmly, sliding the folder across the polished table. Inside were pages of spreadsheets, annotated reports, and evidence that linked directly to the discrepancies. The room went silent. You could almost hear the collective inhale. Holloway's face flushed crimson as he grabbed the papers, flipping through them quickly, his hands shaking slightly. The CFO leaned over, scanning the numbers. Whispers broke out across the table. "This can't be right. Where did this come from? Who authorized these?" Their voices overlapped, anxious, defensive. I didn't flinch. I had lived through worse storms, family betrayal, years of invisibility, endless sacrifices. Compared to that, this was just noise. Finally, I spoke. My voice was steady, almost cold. "These numbers don't lie, and they're not just mistakes. They're deliberate. Every cent has been traced, every adjustment accounted for. You've been covering theft, systematically, for years." The CFO barked, "Outrageous! This is slander!" but his voice cracked under the pressure. The board chair raised a hand, silencing him. All eyes were on me now, the warehouse worker, the overlooked employee, the invisible one who dared to speak truth in a room full of power. My heart pounded, but I pressed on. I've already sent copies of this file to the IRS, the SEC, and to investigative journalists at Channel 7. Whether you deal with it internally or not, the truth is out there. You can't bury it anymore. The silence that followed was suffocating. Holloway's jaw tightened. Executives exchanged nervous glances. One board member rubbed his temples as if a headache had just split his skull. And then, like a spark catching fire, the room erupted. Some demanded immediate suspension of accounts. Others shouted for legal teams. Papers shuffled, phones buzzed, voices clashed. I stepped back from the chaos. For once, I didn't feel small. For once, I wasn't on the outside looking in. I was the one who had shifted the ground beneath their feet. And that was only the beginning. The boardroom descended into chaos. Executives who once strutted around with unshakable confidence now argued like cornered animals. Holloway raised his voice, insisting the adjustments were legitimate business strategies. The CFO waved his hands, demanding order, but the room was no longer under their control. For years, they had orchestrated the narrative, bending numbers to their will. But now, the script was slipping, and the actors were panicking. I stood silently, almost like a ghost in the room. But this time, I wasn't invisible. My presence was the reason for their unraveling. It was strange, almost surreal to watch. Men in $1,000 suits stumble over excuses while my evidence sat calmly in front of them. For once, I wasn't the one trying to justify myself. They were. The chairwoman of the board, a woman named Patricia Lane, finally slammed her palm against the table. Enough! Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The room fell silent. She lifted the folder I had provided and shook it slightly. These numbers are detailed, specific, and cross-referenced. They're not guesses. Someone went through the trouble of laying out a case we cannot ignore. Her eyes shifted to me. And I want to know, why you? The question hung in the air. Why me? Why the overlooked employee from the warehouse floor? Why the one nobody thought twice about? I took a slow breath. Because I lived my entire life being ignored. Because I saw patterns no one else cared to see. And because silence has never done me any favors. Patricia studied me for a moment, then gave the slightest nod. Holloway leapt to his feet, veins bulging in his neck. You can't take the word of a warehouse worker over seasoned executives. His voice cracked, echoing too loud in the polished room. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man screaming about credibility was the same man caught in a web of falsehoods. Then, like lightning, the trap I had set days earlier sprang to life. Phones around the room buzzed with notifications. Board members glanced down at their screens, frowns spreading. News alerts flashed. Channel 7 breaking, alleged multi-million-dollar fraud uncovered at regional logistics firm. My report had gone live. Every spreadsheet, every note, every discrepancy was now in the public domain. The executives froze. Holloway's face drained of color. The CFO's lips pressed into a thin line. Patricia looked back at me, her expression unreadable. For the first time, the power in the room shifted completely. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't pleading. I was simply standing there steady, while the empire of lies crumbled around me. Years of humiliation, years of being told I wasn't enough, years of sacrifice, all of it funneled into this moment. The meeting broke into frantic whispers. Lawyers muttered about damage control. PR heads scrambled to draft statements. Some board members demanded immediate resignations. The tension was suffocating, but I felt strangely calm, as though a storm had finally passed. Still, the climax wasn't over, because humiliation cuts deepest when it's public. The very next morning, the story exploded across local news. Reporters, camped outside the office. Employees whispered in the hallways. Everyone wanted to know who had blown the whistle. My anonymity was gone. Someone leaked my name. Suddenly, I wasn't just a shift lead. I was the worker who had brought down executives. At first, the attention felt overwhelming. Cameras flashed as I walked to my car. Strangers pointed. Some co-workers looked at me with admiration, others with fear. Mark, the one who had doubted me from the start, avoided me altogether, unable to meet my eyes. For once, I didn't feel the urge to shrink. I walked with my head high. But the true breaking point came the following week, during an emergency. Shareholders' meeting. Reporters filled the lobby, cameras rolling. Executives filed in looking like ghosts, pale and tight-lipped. When Holloway entered, boos erupted. Shareholders shouted questions, demanding accountability. He tried to speak, but the noise drowned him out. His power was gone. Then Patricia took the stage, flanked by auditors and lawyers. She held up a report citing numbers that matched mine exactly. "The integrity of this company has been compromised. At the highest levels," she declared. "And it was an employee from within, someone most of us overlooked, who had the courage to bring the truth forward." Her words hit harder than I expected. Overlooked. That word had followed me my whole life. But now, instead of being a label of insignificance, it was proof of resilience. Holloway tried one last desperate move. "This is slander! This entire thing is exaggerated! We'll prove it in court!" But the shareholders weren't buying it. Shouts of "resign" and "fraud" filled the room. The man who once barked orders and dismissed people like me was now red-faced, sweating, and powerless. I didn't need to say a word. His downfall was my statement. By the end of the day, Holloway was suspended, the CFO was under investigation, and federal agencies were already circling. My evidence had become the cornerstone of a case that would ripple far beyond the warehouse. And me? I had become the symbol of what happens when the invisible finally refuses to stay invisible. Walking out of that building, past the reporters and flashing cameras, I felt something shift deep inside. It wasn't just victory. It was vindication. For every time I had been dismissed by my family, for every sacrifice that had gone unnoticed, for every dream that had been stolen from me, this was the moment I took it all back. And it was only the beginning of their regret. The fallout was immediate and merciless. Within 48 hours, headlines dominated every news channel. Warehouse worker exposes multi-million-dollar fraud. CEO Holloway on verge of collapse. From invisible to indispensable, the story of Ruth. I watched from the B. Background as the empire that once belittled me collapsed under its own arrogance. Holloway's carefully built image of power disintegrated. The same man who once laughed at my suggestions was now swarmed by reporters, cameras flashing in his face, questions shouted with a fury he could not silence. At the warehouse, whispers spread like wildfire. For years, my co-workers had treated me as just another shift lead, another tired woman punching in and out. Now, they looked at me differently, some with admiration, others with disbelief. A few avoided me altogether, as though my presence was too heavy, too charged. But one thing was certain. Nobody could ignore me anymore. One evening, I returned home exhausted, only to find letters waiting at my door. Some were from strangers, people who had read the story and felt inspired. "You gave us hope," one note read in messy handwriting. Another said, "You proved that ordinary voices matter." I held them tightly, realizing this moment was bigger than me. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced. The company tried damage control. Press releases flooded the media, claiming commitment to transparency and structural reforms. But the public wasn't buying it. Every time Holloway spoke, his words sounded weaker, thinner. The more he tried to explain, the more he unraveled. The breaking point arrived in the courtroom. The federal investigation had moved quickly, armed with the evidence I provided. Holloway, the CFO, and several executives were summoned to testify. The room was packed. Journalists, employees, and even ordinary citizens who wanted to witness the fall of the untouchables. I sat quietly in the back, hands folded in my lap. When Holloway entered, dressed in an expensive suit that suddenly looked like a costume, the crowd buzzed. His face was pale, lips tight, eyes darting. He no longer carried himself with the swagger of a man in control. He looked smaller, weaker, already defeated. The prosecutor began presenting the evidence, my spreadsheets, my notes, my findings. Each page flashed on the courtroom screen, exposing years of deceit. Holloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sweat gathering on his brow. When asked to explain the missing millions, he stammered. His voice cracked. The courtroom leaned in, hungry for his downfall. Then the moment came. The prosecutor asked if the whistleblower, the one who had uncovered the fraud, was present in the courtroom. Heads turned. My heart pounded. Slowly, I stood. The room went still. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked. Holloway's eyes locked on me. For a second, I saw disbelief, then anger, then finally something that almost looked like fear. The man who once dismissed me as insignificant now faced me as the single greatest threat to his empire. I may have been invisible once, I said, my voice steady, but numbers don't lie, and the truth doesn't stay buried forever. The words echoed across the room. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then came the murmurs, the shifting, the gasps. Holloway looked away, jaw tight, unable to respond. He had no power left. Not here, not anymore. The verdict didn't come that day, but in many ways, it didn't need to. The humiliation was complete. Holloway was no longer feared, no longer respected. His empire was in ruins. His career was finished. When I left the courtroom, flashes blinded me. Reporters shouted questions, microphones pushed toward me. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence spoke louder than any statement. That night, I sat in my small apartment, the city lights glowing through the window. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe. Not just survive, but breathe. I thought of my mother, of the nights I had skipped meals, of the endless hours at the warehouse where I was just another face. All of it had led here. The breaking point wasn't just theirs. It was mine, too. A breaking away from the chains of invisibility, from the weight of silence. I had faced the storm, and I hadn't just survived. I had turned it into my weapon, and as I drifted into sleep, one thought burned in my mind. They had underestimated me their whole lives. Now they would never forget me. When the dust finally settled, Ruth stood at a crossroads. The company, desperate to salvage its reputation, extended an offer that would have tempted almost anyone. A six-figure salary, a senior executive position, and a glowing public relations campaign, framing her as their partner in reform. But Ruth didn't even need a second to decide. She smiled politely, thanked them, and walked away. She hadn't endured sleepless nights, humiliation, and years of invisibility just to be used as another corporate shield. She wanted freedom, not a golden cage. With the whistleblower settlement money and a modest savings account she had guarded like treasure, Ruth charted her own path. Instead of stepping back into someone else's shadow, she built something of her own, a small forensic consulting practice. At first, it was nothing glamorous. A home office, second-hand furniture, a refurbished laptop. But for Ruth, it was liberation. She wasn't clocking in for anyone. She wasn't being silenced or overlooked. Every late night and every spreadsheet she analyzed was now on her own terms. Her first clients weren't Fortune 500 companies. They were small nonprofits, churches, and struggling family-owned businesses that couldn't afford big-name firms. Ruth remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to not have access to expertise, to be treated as less than. She refused to replicate that dynamic. Her fees were fair, And sometimes, when she saw genuine need, she worked for free. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity. Her son, now a teenager, watched in awe as his mother transformed before his eyes. He had grown up seeing her exhausted, juggling shifts, coming home with sore feet and tired eyes. But now he saw something new: confidence, joy, even lightness. She laughed more. She cooked dinner without rushing. She had time to help him with homework, to sit with him and listen, to dream with him about his future. One evening, as they shared a simple meal of pasta and garlic bread, her son said, "Mom, you don't look tired anymore. You look proud." The words nearly brought Ruth to tears. She realized that all along, she hadn't just been fighting for herself. She'd been fighting for him, for the boy who needed to see that survival wasn't the only option, that thriving was possible. Slowly but surely, Ruth's reputation grew. Word spread about the woman who had brought down giants, who had the courage to expose corruption when no one else would. Invitations began arriving: conferences, guest lectures, training workshops. At first she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't her comfort zone. But then she remembered all those nights she'd kept her knowledge hidden. All the times she'd stayed quiet out of fear. She wasn't going to hide anymore. The first time she stood on a stage facing hundreds of young women eager to hear her story, she felt the same nerves she once felt walking into a boardroom with Holloway towering over her. But this time was different. This time the room was hers. "My name is Ruth," she began, her voice steady. "And for a long time I believed being invisible was safer than being noticed. But the truth is, silence doesn't protect you. It just makes you easier to ignore. And you deserve to be heard." The applause was thunderous. For the first time, Ruth saw her story not as a burden, but as a gift. She decided to expand her mission. Using a portion of her settlement, she launched a nonprofit program offering free financial literacy classes to women from low-income backgrounds. She wanted them to know the language of numbers, to understand the power of money, to never be trapped in cycles of silence and exploitation. She taught them not just how to balance budgets, but how to trust themselves, how to see value in their own voices. And with every workshop, Ruth felt another piece of her old self healing. The girl who once dreamed of becoming a forensic accountant had finally arrived, but in a way that was bigger and more meaningful than she'd ever imagined. She wasn't just crunching numbers. She was reshaping lives. Ruth's nonprofit program started small, just a handful of women gathered in a borrowed community center room with rickety chairs and a flickering light overhead. Yet the atmosphere was electric. These were women who had been dismissed, underestimated, and silenced their entire lives, and now someone was finally telling them that they mattered. Ruth began with basics: how to read a bank statement, how to track expenses, how to recognize predatory lending. But as she taught, she realized something deeper was happening. The women weren't just learning about money, they were reclaiming their confidence. One woman, a single mother named Denise, had been working 2 jobs just to stay afloat. She admitted she had never written down her expenses before because she felt it didn't matter. She believed she would always be poor. After Ruth's sessions, Denise started budgeting carefully. A year later, she paid off her credit card debt and saved enough to enroll in night school. When she told Ruth the news, tears streamed down her face. "Because of you," Denise said, "I believe my kids can have a future that looks different from mine." Moments like that reminded Ruth why she had turned down the corporate offers. She could have taken a paycheck and lived comfortably in someone else's system. Instead, she was building something real, something that shifted the ground beneath people's feet. Her consulting practice also began to thrive. What started as helping small nonprofits slowly attracted bigger clients. Mid-size companies wanted her expertise, and eventually, even some Fortune 500 firms, ironically, The very type of companies that once ignored her came knocking at her door. But Ruth was careful. She didn't jump at every offer. She had seen firsthand how easily integrity could be compromised. Every contract she signed came with conditions: transparency, accountability, and fair treatment of workers. If they didn't agree, she walked away without hesitation. For her, it wasn't about growing an empire. It was about building a legacy she could be proud of. Her son became her biggest cheerleader. By high school, he was excelling in math and science, and he often joked that he wanted to be his mom's future CFO. Ruth laughed at the thought, but deep down, she knew it was possible. He was growing up with examples of resilience, integrity, and courage, values that couldn't be measured in dollars but mattered more than any paycheck. Life at home also began to heal. Where once there had been tension and scarcity, there was now stability and even joy. Ruth could afford to say yes to small luxuries: a weekend trip to the coast, a new pair of shoes for her son without guilt, even the occasional dinner out. She didn't flaunt her success, but she allowed herself to enjoy the fruits of her labor. Yet what surprised her most was how her community began to view her. People who had once looked through her now sought her out for guidance. Parents at her son's school approached her for advice on managing household budgets. Local officials invited her to join advisory boards. She went from being invisible to indispensable, not because she had demanded attention, but because she had proven herself through quiet, steady, undeniable action. Still, Ruth never forgot the darker chapters of her journey. She remembered the humiliation of being dismissed in boardrooms, the sting of being treated as a nobody, the crushing weight of silence. Those memories fueled her, reminding her why she could never go back to that kind of invisibility. And then came the moment that truly marked her redemption. It was a crisp fall afternoon when Ruth received an invitation to speak at a national conference on corporate ethics, the keynote slot. Thousands of attendees live streamed across the country. As she read the invitation, her hands trembled. This was the same world that once mocked her, excluded her, and tossed her aside. Now, it wanted to hear her voice. On the day of the conference, Ruth stood backstage, her heart pounding. She looked out at the massive hall filled with executives, students, journalists, and policymakers. For a moment, the old fear crept in, the fear of being dismissed, of not being enough. But then she remembered Denise and all the women in her program and her son's proud words at the dinner table. She took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. "Years ago," she began, her voice firm, "I was invisible. Not because I had nothing to offer, but because people chose not to see me. And maybe some of you in this room are still choosing not to see the people who clean your offices at night, who balance their family's survival on minimum wage, who sit quietly because they believe silence will protect them. But let me tell you something. It doesn't. Silence only protects the powerful. And if you don't start listening, one day those quiet voices will bring down your walls." The audience was silent. And then, one by one, people began to stand, clapping until the hall thundered with applause. Ruth had come full circle. The janitor they once ignored was now shaping the conversation at the highest levels of business, and for her, that was the true redemption. After the national conference, Ruth's life changed in ways she could never have predicted. What began as scattered consulting gigs and a modest community program now blossomed into a movement. Newspapers ran features on her journey. Podcasts invited her for interviews. Universities asked her to lecture about ethics and resilience. But Ruth stayed grounded. She often told her son, "Attention doesn't change who you are. It just shows more people the truth of who you've been all along." She refused to let applause blind her to the mission that started it all, helping the unseen find their voices. With new recognition came new resources. Grants poured into her nonprofit, allowing her to expand into multiple cities. She hired a small staff, Women who, like her, had been overlooked in traditional workplaces. Some were single mothers, some were survivors of abuse, some were immigrants starting over. Ruth gave them not just jobs, but dignity, responsibility, and the chance to grow. She also launched mentorship circles, pairing seasoned professionals with women just starting to rebuild their lives. She wanted these women to know that they didn't have to climb alone. That solidarity was stronger than competition. Slowly, she watched as her mentees opened businesses, went back to school, and broke cycles that had weighed on their families for generations. At home, her son grew into a young man who embodied her values. By his senior year, he had offers from top universities. On the night he received his first acceptance letter, he handed it to his mom with a grin. "Looks like your CFO in training is leveling up." Ruth laughed, tears in her eyes. It wasn't just pride. It was relief. All those nights of struggle, all those sacrifices had brought them here. He was living proof that her fight had not been in vain. Despite the success, Ruth never allowed herself to forget the janitor's uniform folded away in her closet. Sometimes, when doubt crept in or when applause felt overwhelming, she would take it out, hold it in her hands, and remind herself, "This is where I came from. This is why I fight." Then came an unexpected turn of redemption that she hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, she received a message from an old coworker, someone who had once mocked her in hushed whispers when she cleaned the offices late at night. The message was hesitant, almost ashamed. "Ruth, I don't know if you'll even read this, but I wanted to say I was wrong. I laughed at you when you were struggling, and now I see the kind of person you always were. Thank you for proving me wrong." Ruth sat with that message for a long time. She realized that redemption wasn't just about proving herself. It was about changing hearts, even the ones that had once been cruel. That was the full circle. Years later, Ruth's name became synonymous with integrity. Her consulting firm was trusted by corporations, but her real pride was in the nonprofit that had empowered thousands of women. She didn't measure success by dollars earned, but by lives changed. Her favorite moments weren't on big stages or in polished boardrooms. They were in quiet classrooms where women learned to balance their first budgets, in tearful hugs from graduates who had landed their first jobs, in her son's proud smile whenever he introduced her to his friends. "This is my mom. She's the strongest person I know." Looking back, Ruth sometimes marveled at how her story had unfolded. She had started as a woman dismissed, underestimated, written off as invisible. But by choosing courage over silence, by refusing to let betrayal and injustice define her, she had written a new ending, one where dignity, justice, and purpose replaced shame, struggle, and invisibility. Her redemption wasn't flashy. It wasn't about revenge or proving others wrong. It was about finally proving to herself that she had always been enough, and that her voice could echo far beyond the walls that once confined her. And so, when people asked her how she managed to transform her life, Ruth always gave the same answer: "I stopped waiting for permission to matter." They once dismissed Ruth as just a janitor, someone who mopped floors, emptied trash bins, and blended into the background. They didn't see the woman with a degree hanging on her wall, the mother fighting for her son's future, or the mind sharp enough to unravel million-dollar frauds. But here's the truth. Ruth had been cleaning up messes long before anyone noticed. Financial messes, emotional scars, shattered dreams. She didn't need a title to matter. She didn't need a fancy office to prove her worth. What she needed was a chance, and the courage to take it when it finally appeared. Her story is more than one woman's victory. It's a reminder that invisibility is often an illusion. Behind every person you pass without noticing, there might be a lifetime of strength, skill, and resilience waiting for the right moment to shine. Think about it. How many Ruths do we walk past every day? The grocery cashier with tired eyes, the delivery driver rushing through traffic, the custodian sweeping a hallway late at night. Do we see them, or do we only see the uniform? Ruth's redemption teaches us something profound. Silence doesn't keep you safe. It only keeps you small. And the moment you stop waiting for permission to matter, that's the moment everything changes. But here's the twist. Ruth's impact didn't end with her consulting firm or her nonprofit. Years later, she received a letter in the mail, written in careful handwriting. It was from one of her very first workshop students, the single mom who had once believed she would always be trapped in debt. The letter said, "Because you believed in me, I believed in myself. Today, I opened my own bookkeeping business. And guess what? My daughter just got into college on a full scholarship. You didn't just change my life. You changed hers, too. That's the power of legacy." Ruth's fight for dignity created ripples that touched people she had never even met. Her courage echoed into the future, shaping lives far beyond her own. So the next time you see someone invisible, remember Ruth. The mop doesn't define them. The paycheck doesn't define them. Their dreams do. And maybe the quietest person in the room, the one no one notices, might just be the one who saves it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and new videos.